Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll just give it a moment and let everybody get into the webinar. Welcome, everyone. We're just giving it a moment, letting everyone get in. Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Shannon Ganem, and I am the Global Education Director at Magnum Photos. And with my colleague, Pauline Vermeer, Cultural Director at Magnum Photos New York, we are your hosts for the Beyond Magnum series. Beyond Magnum is an in-depth talks program created to explore some of the challenges facing our agency and our industry today. Through this series of free talks in chapters addressing archives, representation, and the future of photography, speakers will share thoughts and engage in debate across a range of issues. Each section will be led by respected figures from the world of photography, and speakers will range from practitioners to academics to subjects of photographs. Recordings from Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 can be found on the Beyond Magnum page and on the Magnum Photos YouTube channel, and you can hear more from our president, Olivia Arthur, who you'll be seeing today, about the aims of the program in the first session. A little bit of housekeeping before we kick off the second session for today. Today's event is being hosted via Zoom webinar, so please put any questions you have for our speakers in the Q&A box, and we'll try and answer as many of these as we can. You also have the chat function there. We recognize that this series of events will likely raise more questions than answer them, and it's the beginning of a conversation. So we thank you for your contributions to that dialogue. You'll be hearing more from us following this program about how we plan to take that dialogue forward for us as an agency and as part of a wider industry. And with that, I'll hand over to Pauline to introduce our chapter co-chairs, Fred Ritchin and Zara Rasool, and we'll also ask Fred to join us on screen. Thank you, Pauline.
Thank you, Shannon. Welcome, everyone. So welcome to the second talk of this last day of Beyond Magnum and of this third chapter towards a future for photography led by Fred Ritchin and Zara Rasool. We are very grateful to you, Fred and Zara, for leading this incredible series of talks. And today we're going to be talking about what is the future for photographic institutions with Sarah Meister, Bill Gaskins, Don Weber, and Olivia Arthur. Fred, I will let you introduce our speakers for today, and thank you all so much for joining us. See you in a bit.
Thank you, Pauline, and thank you, Shannon, for the introductions. Today's the third day of the third chapter on the future of photography. In this one, it's what is the future for photographic institutions with 4 distinguished leaders in the field. We're going to be addressing questions such as, does photography have a future? And if so, what is it? What new thinking is necessary in the 21st century to teach photography, to exhibit it, to publish it, to present it to the public? Can photography still be impactful in the world, including as a societal witness? How does one need to rethink issues of power and control over the making and presentation of imagery? And finally, what role do we want photography to be playing in the world in the next decade or two? So it's my pleasure then to introduce the first speaker, Sarah Meister, who's recently assumed the position of Executive Director at Aperture, an organization founded in 1952, having been curator in the Department of Photography at the Museum of Modern Art, New York, since 2009. The most recent projects at MoMA include considerations of the work of Joseph Albers, the 1967 exhibition New Documents, Making Space, Women Artists and Post-War Abstraction, Dorothea Lange, Francis Benjamin Johnston, Gordon Parks, Luigi Giri, and now on view, Photoclubismo, Brazilian Modernist Photography. She was the original instructor for the online course, Seeing Through Photographs, and has been co-director of the August Sander projects. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Sarah Meister. Sarah, please share your screen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fred. It's a pleasure to be joining you. And thank you for not actually making me share my screen. I'm going to be talking through a few slides. And yes, it's a dramatic moment of transition in the world in general, for sure. Also for me personally, as you said, I was at MoMA for many years, and one of the I would say, if I try to draw a through line through some of my projects in the last, let's say, half dozen years, it's about thinking about how critical issues and reflections from the past can help us address some of the thorniest issues from today. And I think this is one way in which, to speak to the topic of the panel, the idea of photographic institutions are uniquely suited and actually, in fact, bear the responsibility to make these reflections. So what I'm going to talk about for a moment is the way in which two of these projects in particular at MoMA have actually been, for me, long before I even applied for the job as executive director at Aperture, have helped, how Aperture has helped me think through these ideas. So I'm going to begin with an exhibition, Dorothea Lange, Words and Pictures. This is an installation view from that exhibition. It opened last February 2020. And I'm going to go sort of counterclockwise from what you can see here. So on the far right, you see in the distance, you really can't tell what you're looking at all, but it's an area looking at Dorothea Lange's iconic photograph, Migrant Mother, and particularly at the words that have surrounded that from its original publication in the New York Times in 1936 to more recent issue magazines, from Modern Photography in 1952, when it was actually first called Migrant Mother, and to Dorothea Lange's own reflection on the making of that picture in 1960, when she really put down the story that, for better or worse, has been associated with it. And the fascinating thing for me, and this was almost the genesis of this entire exhibition, was realizing how many words, true and false and accurate and inaccurate, had been associated with this photograph since its making. And the photograph is almost like Teflon. It simply didn't matter what it was called, the sort of inaccuracies and errors that were embedded into even the Library of Congress, or what was then the Farm Security or Resettlement Administration card for it. And how can you use those gaps in a generative sense? How can you dig into history to learn something? And this led me to a reflection on the bigger question about words and pictures. In the distance there, you see a long vitrine with issues of Life magazine, which of course had its own very notable and distinctive combination of words and pictures that it put forward. And on the left here, you see the work of Sam Contis. And the reason I chose this installation view and not others from the exhibition is that these three things to me, encapsulate how you can take contemporary artists also and look to their examples and their interest as a way of shedding light on the past. And you can also bear some responsibility as a curator and digging in to find answers to these things. Now, next slide, please. Of course, Lange herself and her involvement with Aperture is part of this. And so in the very first issue of Aperture, for which she was one of the founders, her image here appears on the cover. And it's called Aspen 1951. It was made in the conference that then launched the idea of Aperture. And you'll notice that one of the first featured articles is by Nancy Newhall. It's called The Caption. It certainly informed a lot of my thinking for Dorothea Lange, Words and Pictures. And I love that this photograph is a signpost that doesn't reveal anything about what direction one should take. In other words, she's deliberately withholding the words in order to help me at least, it seemed, reflect on how they were inadequate. Next slide, please. But Dorothea Lange was also continued to be involved with Aperture. This publication was an issue of Aperture magazine. It's called Death of a Valley. It was a collaboration between Lange and Perkle Jones that was finally published in 1961, although the photographs were made in 57. And this is really where I would say Lange's it encapsulates not only another distinctive blending of words and pictures, but Lange's own thinking about the environment and the human impact on the environment. And of course, today I'm sitting here, sorry, with my noisy fans all around me because it's hot, but it's nowhere near as hot here as it is in the Pacific Northwest, near where these photographs were taken. And I think Lange's attention to the environment was something that another contemporary artist, Wendy Red Star, brought forward in her reflections, also in the Dorothea Lange Words and Pictures exhibition. And again, this is something that I think institutions can do, can bring young artists with contemporary concerns to the work of previous generations and help us then understand those previous generations in different ways, at least for me personally. Next slide. So the current exhibition that's on view at MoMA, this was my last as a curator, is called Photoclubismo, Brazilian Modernist Photography. And it covers a chapter in post-war history that was both deeply embedded in international networks, that in fact was existing around the birth of Magnum photos, around the birth of Aperture magazine. But one of the questions was, to me as a curator, how could I, after 2.5 decades in the field, be so unaware of these extraordinary achievements? And to answer that question, there were two elements that were very important for me. One was to look at the biases that might have been, to understand the historical circumstances and establish how well known they were in the 1950s, which is very easy to prove when you dig deep enough, and I won't get into that now. But also the question, to tie it to Aperture, of these were amateur photographers, meaning these were hobbyists. If you asked them who they were, they wouldn't say, I'm a photographer or I'm an artist. They would say, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a teacher, I'm an engineer. And the question of whether, and I would say it's undeniable, this amateur status compromised their ultimate reputation, I think, is a really important one. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that as I'm thinking about this status of the amateur and how it's something that in my contemporary thinking was so absent. And yet in this editorial here from the second issue of Aperture magazine, you read in the bottom paragraph, and you don't have to read it, I'll tell you what it says, but Melton Ferris, who was one of the lesser known founders of Aperture, he describes that Aperture draws no editorial boundaries between amateur and professional, pictorialist and documentarian, journalist and scholar. And I thought to myself, wow, what a wonderfully broad tent he's defining, both by necessity, because of course to segment the field in 1952 would have been foolish, but also because I think that is actually what interests me about photography today, is how can you take the broad interest at a moment when everyone has a camera in their pocket and catalyze reflections on the history to bring deeper understanding and nuance to our approaches to the medium today. And so one more slide, please. So now that I really am at Aperture magazine, this recent issue let's think, no, I guess it was last year, which was guest edited by Wendy Red Star, someone I had worked with for the Dorothea Lange Words and Pictures project, actually someone who's doing an Instagram live drop-in with me today in a couple hours. the idea of how we use contemporary artists to understand our current moment and our history, and to learn from and along with them. This is deeply interesting to me, and I think this is, to me, suggests at least part of the future for photographic institutions. So let's see, I didn't want to talk for too long. But I look forward to the whole conversation we're going to have. So, but also to hear what Donald and Bill have to say, and of course you too, Fred.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. So I just in short, it seems that a lot of the inspiration going forward is coming from the past, from the 1950s and that sort of large tent, as you describe it.
I mean, I think I'm just trying to use this as an example of how the past can be instructive. I think there are lots of different ways we can go forward. And I think engaging with what artists are doing, people ask me, they sometimes say, well, what's the future of photography? And my feeling is that's not for curators or even executive directors of Aperture to define that. That's for artists to look at and for us to attend to as other critical thinkers in the field.
Great. Well, we'll go back to the discussion and go deeper into all of this.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So now I'm going to introduce Don Weber. So Don, if you can appear, that would be good. Who was educated at the Ontario College of Art and Design and worked as an architect with Rem Koolhaas in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, prior to working in photography. He's a recipient of numerous awards and fellowships. His diverse photography projects have been exhibited as installations, exhibitions, and screenings worldwide, including the United Nations, the Museum of the Army at Les Invalides in Paris, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the Royal Ontario Museum. He is the head of the graduate program Photography and Society at the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague, the Netherlands, and is a PhD candidate at Leiden University, PhD in the arts. So it's in the capacity as the leader of the graduate program, Photography and Society, that Don will be addressing how an institution, an educational institution, moves forward in this time of enormous change in the field. So Don, up to you.
Yeah, thanks, Fred, and thanks everyone for having me. I definitely think it's certainly a very viable discussion to have in the role that education actually plays in the questions that we can sort of build and work through in the future. What I decided to do today is I just have a little text I would like to read that sort of outlines some of the, let's say, the goals or the ideas of our program, and then I'm going to show some student works just so we can put it into practice. So the first maybe 5 minutes or so, I'm just going to read a little speech. I want to read it just because I want to make sure that I'm always correct in what I say. But I don't need to introduce myself now because Fred, thank you for that. I have been leading the Masters in Photography program since its inception alongside lots of colleagues at the Academy of Art. We just finished our 3rd year and we're just about in September to have our 4th year. So I would say we're new, but we're also starting to somewhat establish ourselves as well. But what I want to focus on right now is what we're doing at MAPS. And MAPS is our shorthand. So MAPS is the MA in Photography and Society. So if you hear me talking about MAPS, that's what I'm speaking of. But I just want to say I'm quite pleased, actually, as I said, to be here as part of the symposium, because personally, and our program, I hope, we also think often and quite deeply about the future and the contemporary moment and what it can hold for and from photography. So I'm just going to share with you sort of 2 of the foundational concepts and ideals that govern our program and how then we make them manifest in practice. So I hope it gives a little bit of insight into MAPS as a program, also the ideas that surround it and inform it. And that also, I think, will speak to the symposium and the agenda that we're speaking of today. But essentially what underpins our program, Photography and Society, is the essence that is soaked into our culture at MAPS is the strange word that we call undisciplining. So what do we mean by undisciplining? This forms the conceptual, intellectual, and visual basis of our program. And as I said, I'll share some ideas by what we mean when we talk about, but also practice in undisciplined photography. A little bit of background, this notion of undisciplining actually comes out of a series of conversations and chats with one of my closest friends, who's actually a professor of communication design at RMIT University in Melbourne in Australia. And what's sort of very interesting is he's a designer, I'm a photographer, and we've often asked ourselves, how can we actually learn from each other? Why are we, say, isolated from each other in terms of our own disciplines? So by being undisciplined, I would say it means that we can stretch and slip outside the confines that disciplinary boundaries set for us as photographers, or in Oliver's case, as a designer. Because usually as photographic practitioners, we are inscribed in certain compartments or participate as photographers in a bounded field. But photography has multiple modes of engagement: observation, witness, or expression. And of course, I would say a lot more. But what I essentially mean by this is that what we want to do is look at the image itself, but also look alongside the image's social and political conditions to sense other possibilities or alternatives that it may arise. So undisciplining then means that we change our focus away from photography as an object, that is the image itself, moving beyond a self-reflexive practice to one that is an active circulatory process. And what I mean by this is that becoming an undisciplined photographer, we engage with the image and situate photography as a participant in systems of circulations. So that could be the social, the cultural, economic, or technological. It's sort of what I started thinking about the Soviet-era artist Alexander Rodchenko and the writer Osip Brick, who more than 100 years ago said that this was a way of working, quote, operatively. Or decades later, this is what Alan Sekula referred to as the traffic in photographs. But updating this a little bit more for today's era to the contemporary era and for our program at MAPS, I would say an operative practice is then, let's call it, say, a networked practice, and that it helps to forge modes of collaborative and dialogic cultural production. But I also like to think of undisciplined photography as a story so far, and this is to paraphrase the late geographer Doreen Massey, who I would say has a great relevance for photographers, just as a little aside there. So what does she mean by a story so far? It means then that photography is not in stasis, but can be understood as a doing, where it is dynamic and constantly in the process of being made, a participant within a broader constellation of forces that proposes an alternative to the linear neoliberal trajectory that we are subjected to and live in today. So a story so far then is a discovery of other stories and what they tell us. It allows us to build a political argument. That's because they intersect with a multiplicity of stories. So at MAPS, we'd like to dare to imagine other worlds, to provide scenarios and possibilities of how something else can emerge and work against the illusion of linear progress. So then this rethinking, or rather undisciplining, of photography into a more dynamic and processual mode leads to a comprehensive practice where the studying, producing, and looking at images is one where photography functions as a life-giving force, not as a mode of inertia or even death. The last one I just want to address briefly is what it means to be public, which I see that some of our students are participating and they know exactly what I'm talking about here. But for us, this notion of public goes in tandem with undisciplining. So I previously expressed the desire of envisioning and fashioning other worlds through a dynamic photographic practice, one that might challenge the dominant modes of life today. I do believe that we have more to do than just dream of better worlds, but somehow find the action in actually creating those worlds. So that is the role of being public. This is what the photography writer Ben Burbridge spoke of when he talked about this notion of the idea of pockets of time and space where we're able to look and share and produce photography as a means of engaging with the world, which in turn, I would say, produces a collectivity of photograph that then moves, it becomes active. So this symposium right now, I would also say, is just such a pocket of time and space. So that means we ask of our students to participate in this collectivity, to find pockets of time and space outside of the ones that are conventionally laid out for us. So being public is a means to finding an open platform that keeps the ideas and discussions floating around, circulating, which ultimately aims to reclaim a life for photography. So I'm going to show a couple of examples of what we're talking about, and hopefully it will make sense. And I would say that this undisciplining in public would form the foundation of photography as a method of being in the world. So lastly, photography as an undisciplined operation at MAPS, I would say it fosters dialogue, builds community, makes place, invites participation, transforms environment and experience, reveals reality, alters perception, creates disruption, inspires dreams, provides utility, political expression, encourages experimentation, makes nothing happen, imminent cultural shift, alteral cultural change, and ultimately material result. So that's just a little primer on MAPS and some of the values and the discussions that we have in our program. But now why don't we take it from some recent examples of some of our graduates. This is from our graduates that I think graduated even less than a week ago, and from the last year's group. So I'll just share my screen. And okay, so as I said, I'm just going to show a couple of student examples. The first one I'd like to discuss is Alexa Vachon. And I'm showing some examples that also I think can have relevance in terms of the question of the public question that I raised earlier. So Alexa's project explores the body as a site of rebellion in which to interrogate the themes of power, agency, opposition, and emancipation. So what she did is she used the container of BDSM, and the final work looks at the issues of consent and ethical dissemination methods. So the basic question then is, who controls who the audience is, and what power do they have in curating their own interpretations of the work? So in Alexa's project was interesting here because it's essentially also very much tangentially connected to the power relations within photography. But what she did was looking for ways through the container of BDSM to see in which ways consent can actually be negotiated. So also what she did is she made a series of booklets, which you can see here, where anybody now can take these, unfold them, and can be disseminated among, say, specific audiences in an affordable manner. The next project I want to just briefly talk about is Danish photographer Anders Berger, The Halls of Lost Steps. I'm going to focus on one element of his project, and this is specifically his car. Anders's work is about identity, nationalism, and intergenerational memory across borders within Europe. So essentially speaking through the questions of migration. But he's using his car as the literal vehicle for the work itself, so he can present anywhere, as he is continuously collecting new stories and creating new work from the road. So he's turned his car then into a traveling exhibition that can pop up everywhere where there's space to just park his car. And we'd say a sort of side note to this work as well is that he's actually installed a small radio transmitter in his car that can broadcast a 300-meter radius, which he uses, or which he tends to use to share ongoing stories, interviews, and other fragments of his work. So in Anders's case, it's very much a literal sort of perpetual unfolding of a dialogue and exchange of stories. The next project, just to briefly talk about, is an Italian photographer, Federica Iozzo, who I find this a very interesting project as well, because she's sort of looking away from photography as a form of expression, but rather photography as an act of care. So essentially what she wants to know is, how does care through a photographic practice produce subjects, positions, and social relations? So she's interested in photography and social constructs in which, rather than just being the subject, care, in fact, is the very premise of the act of photographing. But also through, care is produced through the dissemination methods. Oops, turn the page, sorry. Through the dissemination methods as well. So essentially what she's doing is she's making photographs that are part of a care album in which she edits together in a shared process with family, friends, and strangers. So what I find interesting here is that photography is not, as I said, a form of expression, but one of care. And I find that this is actually really important for photography, as it shows that photography exists in multiple ways. And it's not always just about even the question of narratives or stories or expression, but in which ways can photography actually foster some kind of relationship beyond and with the image. The next project is Jana Romanova. This is also a very interesting project, which I think would be absolutely relevant for all photographers and photography schools out there today. But essentially what she's created is a participatory performance, or rather a game, which reflects upon the relationships between a photographer, the one being photographed, and the camera. So essentially what she's created are a series of small little exercises and games, and that two people can play, where there's multiple instructions, such as where to move, where to look, and how to feel. So their communication then is really based on controlling each other in front of a camera and for the camera. So then the project exists in the form of video documentation, but it's also translated into a format of booklets and books into when and how do we become readable images. The second last project here is a graduate from last year. This is Anna, a project called Cooking Potato Stories. And essentially, Anna's a Spanish photographer, but has been living in Colombia for a long time. So she's looking at the humble potato as a sort of a trajectory of all kinds of trajectories of, you know, power and violence, colonialism. And yet what she wanted to do is use this potato to sort of gather new narratives and to sort of understand then how narratives can sort of start forming and be shared. So essentially what she's doing is proposing an encounter of narratives around the potato that grows an alternative story. So what she's essentially doing here is where she provided a setting where she was recording other people's stories, which were then gathered, recorded, and then ultimately shared online. And then the last project is by Walter Costa, who graduated last year as well, the Autocollis Collection. This is a very interesting project as well, because it's sort of looking at photography as complicit in systems of violence and power and historical, say, repression, yet in the same sense is very much using photography as a liberatory means. So what Walter was investigating was private Facebook groups where illicit antiques are dug up and then sold through private Facebook groups. So what he's essentially doing is revealing this illicit supply chain, which is also perpetuating the colonialist siphoning of cultural heritage from the global south to the global north. But what he did is he made this little archaeological toy as a way to trigger people's interest and to have them start dialoguing and discussing, you know, what is actually happening here on Facebook. So in his way, he's using the photograph not just as an image, but as a literal object, as a means to conjure and to navigate and to create dialogic exchange, and also then essentially revealing the sort of, let's say, underground networks and culture that digital platforms such as Facebook has. So that's me and MAPS, the Photography and Society program. So I thank you for listening.
Just one follow-up question before we go to the larger discussion later on. In a traditional photography fine art program, you might hold up a photograph and the class critiques it. Is this a good photograph? Is this, you know, in that kind of almost art history sense, so, you know, painting and so on. That's obviously not what you're doing. What is a critique about for you in class?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say to some hand, we somewhat still struggle with that, because photographic education is very much embedded within an art historical trajectory, and we are trying to peel off away from that. And that's also where the notion of this undisciplining comes from, because what that also means then is that let's say the traditional checklist of what makes a good photograph good or bad is not necessarily valid or even, I would say, relevant today. But our discussions are much more based, well, first of all, upon peer-to-peer relationships. Of course, we have a faculty, but the faculty are much more facilitators of exchange. But the discussions that we have around photography are very much based within the questions of public and in circulation. So what are the intentions with the photograph? What role do you have as a photographer with, say, the people that you're photographing or the scenario that you're engaging with? In what ways then is photography acting as an impulse to discuss? So for us, it's never about the photographic project, but it's about a set of practices that you're trying to acknowledge and build for yourself, first and foremost. And as one thing I'll say to the students always as we're heading towards our graduation is that a project comes out of a well-formulated set of practices. So what are the questions that are relevant for you as a photographer? What are questions that are relevant for you today? And then how can you start to translate that through visual and image-based means?
Perfect. Thank you, Don. It was incredibly revelatory and wide open. It helps greatly. So we're going to turn now to Bill Gaskins as the next speaker. And Bill, I'd ask you, oh, there you are. Bill combines personal, social, and historical interests that merge the visual and liberal arts through a rich tapestry of practice in photography, cinema, and nonfiction writing. A critical entry point for his work is his interest in the dual myths of photography and American life through depictions of race and visual culture. His relevance as a contemporary artist garners attention through solo and group exhibitions at many major venues, and he's the author of this seminal monograph of portraiture, Good and Bad Hair, photographs by Bill Gaskins, and the producer, director, and editor of the short film, The Meaning of Hope. He's currently the founding director of the graduate program in photography and media and society at the Maryland Institute College of Art, which just a couple of weeks ago was formally accredited. And it's in that capacity that he'll be speaking with us today. So welcome, Bill. It's up to you now.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Fred, and everyone else who brought me into this conversation. I'm really looking forward to the conversation we have after. So I want to share with you, let me share screen, at least one facet of the process of accreditation that is at this point 11 days old. And so we are talking about a new graduate program. And what I want to share are some of the questions that guided what we did and the objectives and the vision that was informing what ended up being the program that got approved and accredited first through MICA, then through the state of Maryland, and eventually the National Association of Colleges of Art and Design. The questions I formed were based on a number of places that I've been in, from undergraduate school to graduate school, to professor, to adjunct, to writer, to critical spectator, and producer of visual material media culture. And it began with, what should graduate education become? And what should it become in an art and design school that has very, very particular dynamics as a tuition-driven institution, that has a particular set of economics, class and racial dynamics, as well as the role that it plays in educational debt in very, very unique ways. What needs to be taught? What needs to be learned? What needs to be unlearned? And how can a graduate education focused on photography and media provide more than an education in art? One of the things that was said yesterday, I thought was really, really important by Zara, was, it's really not that.
You're still on the first slide, you're not full screen, so I just wanted to.
Oh, still on, okay, this is what happened before. See, what I'm gonna do is, Back out. So what can you see now?
You're on the fourth slide, but you're not full screen.
Yes. All right. So I'm going to. Do you see full screen now?
No.
I think if you push the little thing just to the right of the sliding, just to the left of the sliding scale that says presentation mode, you're hovering over it right now. That might, oh, go down. Sorry. There's
Go
another
down.
arrow. Oh, my arrow is having misleading.
All right.
Down to the right. Or you can do up
Okay.
there. Yeah. Just to the left of that sliding button. Just to
Right.
the left.
Right.
Nope, other side.
This one.
Yeah, that one. Try that.
That's what I used before. Can you see it now?
No,
No.
actually, sorry. Bad
Okay, no
suggestion.
problem.
Apologies.
No problem. So what I'll do is this.
It may also be built if you have shared the program rather than your full screen, or we can also see it.
Is what I'll do.
It's definitely legible as it is. So, because the font is so nice and bold.
Can you see that? Is that clear?
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, so as I said, how can you provide more than an education in art? You know, the democratization of the technology. Basically, as Zahara said yesterday, around what she was doing with her collaborators, learning how to use the tools is the easy part. Knowing what to do and why is the more challenging. And so how do we go from a siloed atelier culture to a communal collaborative one? MFA cultures are known for being either full residencies in the view of many students, and if not full residencies, they become a place where one is supposed to build inventory to meet market demands in the fine art market. One of the things that Martin Luther King once said is that our scientific power has outrun our spiritual power, and that we have guided missiles and misguided men. One could say the same thing about smart cameras and the people who use them. So my question is, how can we train students to become smarter than the tools and the technology that they use? And like, what are the implications and what will be the consequences of a reality that is on augmented and virtual terms? And what will be the knowledge base that informs these terms or so-called realities? Let's not forget the fact that we're in the midst of what some person has called denialism as a political tool. And the role that the image plays is inexorably connected to it. So how can we instruct and inform students to be curious, intrepid, and engaged thought leaders? My understanding of graduate education is that we're producing people who are going to be thought leaders, and not necessarily people who are going to be credentialed, and not necessarily people who are seeking to have a higher income status or class status alone. How can we design, guide the production of knowledge and meaning through visual culture within and beyond fine art? Photography and media are fundamentally interdisciplinary, and it requires an interdisciplinary approach to its production and its reception. So why can't we have people talking about marketing? Why can't we have people talking about fashion? Why can't we have people talking, theorizing, and challenging conventions in fashion, conventions in photojournalism within an MFA program? What happens when we do? Pardon me. So how do we develop interdisciplinary and research-informed image-making influencers? Because at the end of the day, what we do is not an innocent exercise. And what is the role of, excuse me, what is the role of ethics? And what is the role of ethical ambition in a MFA program? In a world where people are seeking to be the next great art star. And how can we do this through an unlimited and borderless practice? So we're talking about people who are reading both Adweek as well as Artsy. And how can we have a postgraduate outcome that is based in service, substance, and sustainability? One of the things that I talk about with my students a lot is an essay by Eva Cockcroft titled Abstract Expressionism, Weapon of the Cold War. One of the things that she says, and I'm paraphrasing, is that to understand what makes a particular art movement successful is to investigate and examine the particulars of patronage and the ideological needs of the powerful. Now, at the end of the day, we are all serving someone or some body and some institutional interests. And so how do we make the students who are in these spaces much more conscious about whom they are serving and who else is involved and invested in what they're doing beside themselves? And when we talk about the difference between visual culture and the production of art, in my view, we're talking about visual material media culture that is impacting the way people see and the way they think. Not everything that comes out of an MFA program does that. And the elephant in the room is the postgraduate sustainability of the students and the people who are leaving these programs, and what kinds of literacies are enabling them to have independence over what it is they're doing and what it is they want to build. With that said, how can students develop for-profit platforms for production and distribution of their ideas? Not too far from where I live in the Bronx, there's a bookstore and a wine bar. And outside of that building is this graphic that says, "Reach for the world, but touch the hood first." And so for me, I think what's important is building downtown relationships and collaborations as curriculum metrics. So one of the things that will be important for the candidates for the degree within this program is who in the city of Baltimore will be part of their graduate committee. And not in a ceremonial sense, but someone who is going to be posing questions from beyond the academy, and that will help them understand that there's an audience beyond people with MFAs that they need to be thinking about and concerned with. And one of the most important things that needs to be unlearned, based upon my experience, again, as a student, as a professor, and now as the director of a graduate program, is unlearning the idea that white supremacy and patriarchy are opinions about very, very structural and very, very embedded aspects of not only the culture of photographic education, but also the world that is beyond photographic education. And if we understand white supremacy and patriarchy as intersectional, then I think it's important to look at the status of Black women in photographic institutions as the barometer of the health of these institutions for everyone who's in it. And I want to end with this quote. "The possible has been tried and has failed. It is time to try the impossible." That's a quote from Sun Ra. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, so just one follow-up question. It seems what you're talking about to a certain extent is media literacy, a kind of understanding of structural issues, a kind of understanding of how it could be repressive as opposed to opening up things, and power relationships, and who gets to tell whose story, and how it happens. Is there a sense that your students or your institution has ways or strategies of reaching out to, like you said, non-MFA students, to the world, to other people, and say, it's really important for you guys to understand media literacy. This is how you do it. Do you have any suggestions along those lines of thinking?
That's a great question, Fred. One of the advantages I have is that I'm in a city that's at the center of a great number of the problems that are both national and international. And I'm also in an institution that has a number of points where I can collaborate with people in social design. I can collaborate with people who are in community arts. I can collaborate with people in Master of Arts teaching. And it's one of the things that I encourage the cohort to do. And one of the ways I do that is by bringing in as many voices outside of photography and media as I can, so they can be exposed to the ways that people outside of this practice conceive, manage, and complete ideas that become visual, that become material, and that become points of media. And I think that media literacy is one thing, but I think there's another kind of literacy, and that's civic. And that's to understand that what is on social media is a place that's not terminal. It might be a place to start, but to draw conclusions from what happens through what I call the tyranny of the present is problematic, especially for people who are producing visual material and media culture. We have people who, as I referred earlier, who believe that white supremacy, or to assert the underpinnings of this country being in white supremacy, is my opinion. Mm-hmm. That is not a fact. Mm-hmm. You have people who are saying that to talk about patriarchy is to be talking about something that's in the past as well, or somebody's opinion. And so it's really important for civic, social, and historical literacy as much as visual literacy to be part of this.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Bill. That was great. It illuminated many of the issues we're facing. Thank you. So now I'm going to turn to Olivia Arthur, who is known for her in-depth photography, examining people and their personal and cultural identities. Much of her work has illuminated the daily lives of women living in countries as varied as Saudi Arabia, India, and across Europe. A more recent focus on large format portraiture has brought her work back to the United Kingdom. And a quote from Olivia, "For me, part of the power of still photography is the ambiguousness of pictures, the ability to give a hint about a scene or event without being too absolute." Olivia was born in London, grew up in the United Kingdom, studied mathematics at Oxford University and photojournalism at the London College of Printing. She began working as a photographer in 2003 after moving to Delhi and was based in India for 2.5 years. She became a full member. She co-founded Fish Bar, a publisher and a space for photography in London, in 2010 with Philip Ebeling, and she continues to return to India and to work in London where she lives. Olivia became a full member of Magnum Photos in 2013. She is now the president of Magnum Photos and one of the people who has spearheaded this month-long conversation called Beyond Magnum. So I turn it over to you, Olivia.
Thank you very much, Fred. And thank you for chairing this. And I'm just going to share some words that I've written here just now, essentially to thank you and everybody who's been involved in this program for what you've been giving us. It's been amazing. So I'd like to take this opportunity to reflect back on some of the things that we heard and learned over the course of this series of talks. And perhaps to do that, we need to take a step further back and reflect on why we initiated them in the first place. The Beyond Magnum series has come out of Magnum's archive review project that we started back in the autumn to examine, reflect on, rethink the context of, and understand the implications of the work from our archive of images spanning some 80 years of history. And the archive review project itself came out of the conversations that were going on across the industry and the questions that were being asked, some specifically at us and many just at institutions and gatekeepers across our industry in general. In an industry that's not that well defined and is full of individuals working in many different ways, these gatekeepers have over time become incredibly powerful and have been the ones who defined the way most of us would get to see images of the world and how moments would be preserved in our memory and icons created. Photography grew up in its early years as a somewhat privileged profession, and throughout the 20th century, that vision continued to be defined by a certain few. But more recently, challenges to that status quo have made us think more about the stories that are being told, the way they're being told, and who is telling them. These challenges make absolute sense when given any thought, but the fact that we hadn't thought about them before is in itself revealing. For many, I think it was also hard to see that the gatekeepers were in fact that, and that there was a perpetuation of the same kind of imagery and point of view over decades. And so we started asking these questions, not just ourselves, but we asked other people who've spent more time thinking about the important issues here to help us think and reassess and learn. I'm so grateful to all of the people who've come forwards and helped us to make this series and been willing to share their sometimes quite difficult stories. I've heard a lot, I have learned a lot from hearing them, and though I realize there are still many questions out there for us to address, this has been a really good starting point, and I hope it will precipitate even more. So to reflect on some of the things that we have heard. The series began with discussions on archives, curated by Azu Wagubu and Asya Yagmurian, who talked about the notion of care and looking after an archive in order to be able to tell its stories while honoring its creators. This chapter also included a very powerful talk by Magnum photographer Sim Chi-yin, whose own family story and personal archive led her to work with British colonial archives and establish another history of the Malayan insurgency. Her talk also asked us to reflect on the different ways that images from archives can be read or understood, and to ask some important questions. Whose fact was it? Whose truth was it? We definitely have a lot to learn about the importance of rereading archives to offer counter-narratives. Wayne Modest raised the challenges for some artists working with historically Western institutions and whether or not to take a seat at the table and try and change institutions from the inside, as opposed to building their own inclusive institutions. Azul concluded by reminding us of the importance of context, the primordial road of thoughtful and thorough captions to accompany the images as archives and libraries in an age when so much is accessible online. issues around questions of representation and self-representation were discussed at depth in Antony Oliveira and Noel Flores Teilhard's chapter. We looked into the limits of representation, being honest about who photographers are really doing the work for, themselves perhaps, and the importance of self-representation for marginalized communities and individuals were also discussed. The problems of dubbing subjects vulnerable according to whom? These talks raised questions of agency and empowerment. In the context of documentary and socially engaged photography, what is the responsibility of the photographer? Photographer is a witness. Photography provides evidence. What are we photographing it for? If our photographs do not serve the marginalized people that we choose to depict. The conversations of chapter 2, as well as chapter 3, highlighted the importance of meaningful and thoughtful collaboration. Agatha Arquet spoke openly and movingly about her experience as a collaborator and subject in Bika de Porta's work. She encouraged us to think about the expectations of the subject and also the limitations of collaboration. They put into question the notion of authorship that has become more and more blurred. Author of what? Susan Meiselas asked. In this context, what can and should institutions do to change? Mark Seeley pointed out that working within institutions, you sometimes have to eat yourself in order to try to bring about change from the inside. In this new image-centric world, how do you have an impact to change and help our societies with sincere, ethical, and authentic narratives? We also recognize the gift that social media is offering photographers today in terms of representation and self-representation, and as well as the violence that it can generate. That context is key, and that journalism has never been more important. And yesterday we heard about the importance of community for self-representation, as well as the cathartic role that participatory and collaborative practices can play, especially amongst youth and during peace processes. As I think back on the discussions from the month, there are a couple of things that stand out for me. The first is particularly about absence and thinking not just about the questions we need to ask of the images that are out there, but what is missing. Missing parts of the story that might have been edited out by the photographer, missing images that indicate parts of a history that has been glossed over or intentionally avoided, and missing voices who have never had the chance to tell their own stories, or any story for that matter. There are also times of political unrest when holding back on sharing images can be seen as a political stance in itself. So as we take time now to look back over our archive and think about what is there and our responsibility that comes with it, we should also take time to look at the holes and ask ourselves what we can learn from the images that are not there. The second thing that stood out for me is that we need to rethink what we use photography for and what it can and can't do. As it has grown as a medium, we have learned to think more carefully about the relationship between truth and photography. And we have come to a point where we no longer expect the two to go hand in hand. Even without manipulation before or after the making of images, we have learned that the subjectivity of the photographer is a complicated and far-reaching thing. What I might show in my images is what I want you to see and in the way I want you to see it. Of course, first of all, my images have to fight to find their own voices out there in the sea of imagery. Otherwise, you might not get to see them at all. And how do I get you to see them? Hopefully because somebody thinks they are worthy of being given a platform and brought to light. But who gets to decide that? In the past, the authority to decide was very much in the hands of those gatekeepers we mentioned before, or the people whose ideas had been influenced by them. Nowadays, it's a lot less personal than that, and there's a good chance that you'll never see my images at all because I haven't got enough Instagram followers or likes on my previous images. Or even perhaps there is an algorithm somewhere that will decide whether it is good or not based on some computer learning and patterns of what else has been liked out there. So the world is full of images. Everything is recorded everywhere, many times over. When we stand in line with other photographers, or even just regular people with their phones, taking pictures that they're also taking, we might wonder what the point is. Magnum photographers throughout their history have been there to bear witness to what is going on in the world, both at the big important moments and the small quiet ones. And are we needed to bear witness anymore if there are so many others who could do it too? I would like to argue that Magnum photographers have always done more than just bearing witness, and that their deep involvement in the stories they have chosen to focus on has been what has fundamentally shaped the many different bodies of work. In that, they have also been witness to events and moments as they unfolded, but they have also commented and found a different take on the story as it might have been seen in a straight news context. I think our photographers will continue to do these things, but that the ways and the voices will grow and broaden. And it is that broadening that will be the key to making the work relevant. So then if I come back to the title of this talk, and what is the future for photographic institutions? I have to begin by asking, at what point did we become a photographic institution? Or are we really one at all? Magnum was founded as a collective of photographers, and our purpose was to promote and protect the work of the collective, as well as finding assignments. We're still just a collective of photographers, that we have quite a complex organization that often defies being pinned down, and it's often difficult to explain to people who expect something more of us. And we're also not one voice when it comes to sharing an opinion on things that are going on in the world. Many of our members have very strong feelings about different political, social, cultural issues, but they're almost never shared by all the members, and the organization or institution is there to represent all of the voices. So we try to step back from taking a stance on political issues and let the voices of the individuals have the stage. It's not always easy or clear, and often we have to remind ourselves that Magnum represents the photographers, not the other way around. But we should acknowledge that if people see and look to us in a certain way and see us as an institution, not a collective, that we should already take the responsibility that comes with that. Many photographic institutions have spent most of their existence fighting for photography to be seen as serious, as grown up, as having weight. And as we get to the turning point, that photography is important, is a global language. What do we do with that? And how do we use or abuse the responsibility that comes with that? It connects somewhat with what Shahid Alam was saying about fighting to be heard and taken seriously from the outside. And then at some point having to look at oneself and see that you've become the establishment yourself. That's a huge success. But it also means having to think about the implication of one's work in different ways. Magnum has to think about the implications of the work of its photographers and its archive too, and reflect on the fact that we have become an establishment and have expectations to live up to. I think the most important thing we can do moving forwards is to broaden the range of our voices and perspectives. It's something we've been working on for the last few years, but as with everything, it's a slow journey and one that's being taken with consideration. I would love to see us with a great intake of new, exciting and varied photographers every single year. And I believe we can grow and learn along with all of these voices. But we also need to remember that we have a tough membership process that takes some years, and that change, however actively it is sought, will not change us overnight. And I think that is important too. Along with many other old organizations or institutions, we are slow, but also considered. And it's equally important that we don't throw out our own history as we move forwards, but learn how to adapt and understand and bring the history along with us as we change. With our 75th anniversary coming up next year, we're working on a series of collaborations that will address some of the pressing issues of our time, including the fragility of democracy, the notion of the social contract, climate emergency, amongst others. Magnum is still very much dedicated to representing and supporting political and social issues that deeply matter to the individuals that constitute the collective. And that we, photographers and staff, will all work towards a more inclusive and collaborative future for Magnum and for photography to ensure past, present, and future narratives that represent us all. I also hope that as the archive review project moves along, and as we get to the point of understanding what is there, how we should look after it, protect it, put it in better context, we will also find more opportunities. We will also find opportunities to invite more people in to look at, work with, and find new narratives inside our vast archive. The last thing I would like to be doing would be to shut it off. There is so much to be learned and told from all these years of history. So as we move forwards, I would hope to see a breadth of new photographers coming in, widening the discussions that we have, and perhaps making us think differently about photography. But the important thing for the organization is to marry that new energy with the thought and the vision of the archive and the history of the photographers who made Magnum what it is, by insisting on their independence by caring deeply about the issues that they were covering, by staying behind long after a story could have been considered finished, and by adding their own vision to it. It's what drove photographers of the past, and it will also drive those of the future, only with those visions coming from a wider variety of perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Then just one follow-up question. In the 1980s, I worked on an exhibition and book of 400 photographs by Magnum. It was called In Our Time, The World is Seen by Magnum Photographers. And the sense was the last half century of history, Magnum was witness to. The collective voice was more important than the individual voice. The photographs themselves were treated as documents of history, as witnesses to tell us where we were in the world. And if you were going to do something like that in 2021, you know, the last half century, how would it be different than it was done in the 1980s? Would you privilege the individual voices over the photographs? What would be some of the differences that you would think about?
Well, I think one of the things that has changed is the different forms with which we use photography. And there's always been variety in Magnum. And I think we tend to think of a certain kind of photography when we think of it, but actually if you go right back in the archive, there is, you know, right from the very beginning, there is a huge variety. But I think that variety would just be much, much broader. And I think it would include, for example, you know, Thomas's Instagram captures that, you know, were in a discussion yesterday. And so the breadth of the kind of work that you would see would be greater. But I don't think that there's any less, I don't think that that's any less about bearing witness. I think it's still about bearing witness. I think it's still telling the stories of our world, what's going on today. It's just that the ways that we do it have got broader. And I think the voices already have broadened somewhat, and you would see that in I mean, I would love to do it, honestly. I think it would be great. I think it would be very interesting for us to see how we would tackle doing that, because the way you would put it together, you wouldn't have necessarily the individual images, you know, as a big slideshow all going together, but you would have the stories, the different approaches, and it would take you maybe to slightly broader places. And I think that would be a great thing. I'd love to do it.
Okay. Well, next on the agenda, once we finish. Okay, so I'm going to ask everybody to reappear, the panelists. We have about 18 minutes to discuss everything. So first, let me just put it this way. For all the panelists, you've heard each other talk. Does anyone want to respond to anything that's been said before I start asking questions? Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you. I mean, I don't have to go first, but I will say I was completely inspired by so much of what all three of you said, and maybe, but there were two things in particular that I just wanted to raise because I found them to be surprising and surprising connections between curatorial practices and educational and practitioners. So one is maybe starting with what Olivia said about questioning the gatekeepers, which I felt, which was a big part of what Photoclubismo, this Brazilian modernist photography exhibition, became, because the idea of how, and implicating myself in this, how as a curator trying to make sense of the messy history of photography, I used to use words like vernacular as a way of distinguishing kinds of practices from fine art. And in this, I was trying to be helpful. It wasn't coming out of a place of, but in doing that, I realized that I was lumping together amateur practices, for instance, and that was one reason why these names were unknown to me. It wasn't simply that these were people working in Brazil, and so the so-called periphery. And I loved your mention of sort of vulnerability according to whom, periphery according to whom, this idea of at least acknowledging the way in which we've centered ourselves and our perspective, I think is really important. But then to bring that to what Bill was saying about these, how do we talk about not just amateur practices, but artists who are motivated by profit, who need to make a living, and that very need to make a living then somehow has inadvertently disqualified them from being taken as seriously as those who are allowed or privileged, sufficiently privileged to be able to ignore financial considerations. And again, implicating myself, I regret that the first time I ever thought about this as a curator was back in 2010. I wrote about Stieglitz and his initial embrace of artists like Gertrude Cazebier and Frances Benjamin Johnston, and putting them on the pages of camera notes and celebrating their work because they were like artists with a capital A, and they made work that responded not to the concerns of the day, but the sort of ethereal pictorialist practices. And yet, when each of them opened commercial studios because they had to support their families, they fell out of favor with him. They were only mentioned in the most dismissive of terms. And I see the way this has had an impact. For instance, Jean Matusami Ash did a beautiful book in 1985 called Viewfinders, Black Women Photographers, 1985. And the number of women whose work appeared in that book, but that have still not been considered or integrated into any institutional narratives is really a disgrace. But I think the key to it is thinking about, they were making, when you flip through it, I'm struck with the fact that these are all commercial photographers. And so how do these labels of commercial photographers or photojournalists or amateurs, these are ways of making sense of the word, but they are also massively responsible for creating the structures that have created, as you were saying, Olivia, these absences, what's not a part of the history that we tell. And so I think conversations like this are incredibly inspiring for me, because they point to how, even no longer as a curator, but how can Aperture as an organization, and again, Olivia, when you were talking about how did Magnum become an institution, can you be an organization without being an institution? How does a school, how can we embrace our educational function without being a school? These are interesting. So I've really appreciated hearing from you all. And I guess that those were some of my initial responses or notes.
So one of the things that strikes me is that the 20th century, we had a myth, which we all knew was not true, that the camera never lies, that the photograph was testimony, that it was enough to show it and people believed it. A girl being burned by napalm in Vietnam, she was being burned by napalm in Vietnam. That no longer works. There's all kinds of dissonant ideas, recontextualization, trillions of images on social media, in the US, red states, blue states, all around the world, all kinds of different things. So it seems to me that all of you are talking about a new photography that's not the same as a 20th century photography. It doesn't depend on a myth. It doesn't depend on, even though the myth wasn't valid. You're looking for new channels. You're looking for different ways of doing it. What Bill called civic responsibility, and Don was talking about these new channels and these, breaking out of the kind of, small departments and being multidisciplinary. And what Olivia was talking about, the voices of Magnum photographers, as opposed to the single image that's so important. There's almost no iconic imagery anymore in the world, whereas there was much of it in the 20th century. So does anybody want to respond? Is that one of the motivating factors for all of you, or in your thinking? Is that just an old conversation and you're on to new things? Please take it away, Don, Bill, Olivia.
I think it's important to understand how intersectional things have become. And as I said, how can we have people who are smarter than the technology that they're using? There are amazing things that have taken place technologically around image making, excuse me. But unfortunately, there are market forces that produce planned obsolescence in these technologies that are about the bottom line for these companies. I used to say, if you want to be successful in photography, you should be working for either Epson, Apple, or Adobe. Because they have a plan for their sustainability in the obsolescence of their technology. So what this means is we have a generation of people who want the analog. They want something more tactile in their experiences. But at the same time, these people are reading books now in ways they weren't before, especially post-pandemic. And they want to be engaged in conversations with people that are about things that are not digital, but enduring and eternal, and they're turning those things over. And I think it's really, really important, at least from my point of view, is how do you bring people who know the difference between an f-stop and a bus stop in a graduate program and have them be outward facing, not simply through the images and media they produce, but being able to sit at the tables around conversations that their work is about. So if somebody is dealing with the issue of immigration through photography and media, I want them to be able to write about it. I want them to be able to speak about it and not be seen as somebody who's providing illustrations for people who are the thinkers.
Right. And Don, we have about 8 minutes left. Don, I don't want to leave you out of this. Do you have any final thoughts or other thoughts or things you'd like to say?
Sure. I think, well, it's really nice to hear what Bill was speaking about in his graduate program, because it sort of nicely aligns very much with a lot of the things that we're talking about just on the other side of the ocean. And I think first and foremost, I come from photojournalism. That's my history, and part of the, I guess, the impetus for the MAPS program is sort of thinking through my own relationships that I've had to photojournalism in the past, which was very much, let's say, subservient, that I sort of am expected to wait for an assignment, and I have some certain kinds of independence to sort of reach out to the certain outlets, Newsweek, etc., Der Spiegel, and that's a very sort of dedicated relationship that exists, and it's a sort of fixed relationship that exists. But one thing that I also try to navigate with the students and with the program is, I think, Bill, you just mentioned it as well, but this notion of conversations. And I never really felt as a photojournalist that I had an opportunity to sort of be in conversation or in correspondence with anything other than those, say, very determined relationships that were already formed. So one thing when we talk about public, or we even use impact, but that's a very nebulous concept. I don't necessarily want to go there today. But the notion, I think, of a conversation is an important one, because what it allows, for me at least, is that the student or the photographer, myself included, actually has opportunities and actually has an ability to be and contribute to within certain dialogues. So first and foremost, if a conversation can sort of happen, through encounters, etc., then I feel that the student and the future photographer, or the practice that is starting to be developed, actually affords an opportunity for that photographer to go back to the very earlier point about, this notion of making a living. But it also means that making a living can actually become much more expansive rather than inclusive. So it's not an exclusive format of making a living. It's actually an inclusive way but it's also expansive. And to me, I find that a very exciting position to be in, because it does free the photographer from, let's say, the confines, as I spoke about earlier, to be within the very sort of restricted regimen that I was in photojournalism. And one thing I've already started to notice is, it might be a little simple thing, but for example, we, part of the master's project is our students have to obviously make a visual work. They have to write, just as Bill is talking. They need to be able to articulate the position that they're taking, the relationship to the topic and such. The notion of public. But for example, with the writing component of our project, it's not a static element, but it has to sort of be, well, like Dorothea Lange, the relationship between words and text needs to become activated in some sense. And just one little small thing with one of our recent graduates, Kata, she wrote a really interesting thesis that was essentially questioning her own practice, which was one that was very much embedded within a commercial gallery situation, and where exposure and recognition becomes the main currency. So anyway, she wrote this thesis, but in the end, what happened is the public library in Rotterdam saw it. They bought a few copies, they put it into their library. She's originally from Budapest in Hungary, so she's having a series of conversations in bookstores with young photographers about what does it mean to, say, be commercialized as a photographer? How can we as young photographers actually navigate the questions of commerciability, market forces, etc., just as Bill was talking about Epson or Adobe, but to actually maybe turn that around for ourselves to sort of initiate the responsibility from us, rather than pivoting and waiting, say, for the broader institution to impose it upon. So it's just sort of a slight reversal of fortune, I would say.
I think it's an enormous reversal in terms of the expansiveness you're talking about versus being on an assignment, being reactive, a guy with a camera. It's a whole different lifestyle. It's a whole different approach that you're talking about, I think. Look, we've got 4 minutes left. Olivia, you're our host. Do you want
Okay, I'll just say something in response to these comments here, and then there was a word that I think you used, Bill, in your talk, which was innocence, and I think in a way it connects to what Sarah was talking about, vernacular photography, and maybe even what you're all speaking about now, in this idea that we learn all these things, but we also need to unlearn them and take them away, and we kind of search for this idea of innocence and not being influenced by the photography that's gone before, and I think there's a little bit of a turnaround and wanting to look for that. And it's a very difficult thing, because we now maybe we overthink photography and we talk about it a lot, and we can't get away from everything that we've seen and everything we've been influenced by, and there's this sort of very special thing out there that we look for, which is innocence in just going out and being a photographer on your own without thinking about all those things. And it's incredibly difficult to be part of an institution and be part of a process and a program and learn it all, but then take it away and try and find yourself in the middle of it. And I think that somehow maybe weaves in between what you were all saying there.
For me, Gordon Parks is the example of what a borderless practice is. And I think it's important to understand that this man did not spend time in an academy. And I bring that as an example to not just the people who were in my program, but to anybody who's interested in what is the outcome of curiosity. And I think his life was certainly a reaction to borders placed around him, or attempt to place borders around him. But at the end of the day, he was a curious person, and I think that's an essential tool at this stage.
And I might just add, I love that phrase of Parks as having a borderless practice, because it's not, I think, to sort of push back a little bit on the value of innocence, I think the challenge and the opportunity is to actually look critically at what has happened before, and to use those past examples to inform by the way, I should say this is also why I'm happy I'm not an artist, and how I know I could never be one, is that what you all are trying to do is very, very difficult, meaning all I can do is, is reflect on these creations. But to me, as a curator and as a critical thinker, it's not, the goal is less innocence, but more, how do we take the example of the tension between Stieglitz and Casebier and Johnston? Or how do we take the example of how Gordon Parks, because of that borderlessness, may have been excluded from certain narratives because he was working for a magazine, and as if that somehow, and then the inability to say, well, how can I reconcile his capacity as a filmmaker, as a photographer, as a musician, like all of these things, how were those actually held against him reputationally? And how can we learn from those biases and those absences to better attend to practices that are similarly borderless today? And I think, Don, sound to me like what you and what Bill are describing as you're teaching to your students is like, don't, to try to push against these borders that are being put up as obstacles, and to, but not to ignore them and attain some sort of innocent state, but really a level of critical reflection, that is needed today. I mean, certainly needed from people in my kind of position, but I think also for artists too, and photographers working across genre.
I mean, just to synthesize a little bit the different streams, for me as a teacher, what I do is I try to deconstruct to reconstruct, to make it better. Just pull it apart, what works, what doesn't work, what's bad, forget it, and try to reconstruct, do it better. We have all these tools that Bill talked about. We have all these possibilities. How do you do it better? What do you do? And I think you've all articulated that in multiple ways.
But to be clear, Sarah, the only association I or my program has with innocence is the critique of it. Okay. No, it's not.
I kind of figured we were aligned with that, but I just wanted to, since Olivia, anyway, yes, good. Thank you.
Well, thank you to everybody. And I turn it over to Shannon.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you so much, everyone. That was an incredible conversation. I can't wait for doing the kind of the highlights of some of these quotes. It was incredibly inspiring. Fred, I love that one. Deconstruct to, what was it? Deconstruct to reconstruct.
Yes.
Yeah. Incredible.
Psychoanalysis in photography. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all.
Thank you all. Wonderful to meet and see you.
Thank you. From me as well. Thank you all so much. It's really a pleasure to be here at this. I mean, it's been a long time in the making, this series, and it's been amazing to have. I mean, it went way beyond what I expected of this program. So I'm really,
as so much of what Magnum does. So thank you for bringing us together.
Thank you all.
Thank you
for your contribution.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you.
See everybody back again tonight,
All right.
7 o'clock British
Bye-bye.
British summer time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye.